Good morning and welcome to our next webinar of the day, responding to State of California solicitation. This is actually the first of a two-part webinar today. The first part is given by Nancy Pigeon, and the second part will be given by Christina Jones, our lead procurement specialist. So thanks to both of you for doing this. We're not going to do a full intro. I just want to let people know that questions are welcome. We have 30 minutes for the first webinar and 30 minutes for the second, and we'll have a Q&A about 5 to 10 minutes after each presentation. If you have any questions, please enter them into the Q&A tab at the bottom there. You can network and say hi in the chat, but if you want a question read aloud during the Q&A, please put it in the Q&A. And put them in as soon as they come into your head, because once we get to that Q&A, it's nice to have some material to run off. So let's go ahead and get started. First off of the day, is Nancy going first or?
No, it's actually me.
Oh, it's Christina going first.
But I didn't get it quick enough.
Oh, okay, I mixed it. No, Christina Jones, our senior lead procurement specialist. All right, thanks, Christina.
Oh, sure. Thanks, James. So thank you, everyone, for joining. If you've been with us all day, I'm sure this is, I hope this will add value to your time, but I know there's been a lot of sessions, so we'll be moving through this pretty quick. So Nancy will have a chance to share. So I will start by sharing with you about state solicitations, RFPs, what's the difference between that and IFBs, for example. And again, this will be a short overview because hopefully you'll have enough time to get a good understanding of state solicitations or state requirements, and also have some time for questions. So what we're going to cover today is to define the different procurement methods. For instance, as I just mentioned, are they looking for an invitation for bid, IFB? Are they looking for a RFP, a request for proposal? Or they also have something that's more advanced also in that category that you may or may not have heard of. And then we'll understand what proposal submission requirements look like or what they should look like. And talk a bit about, from the contracting officer's perspective, as far as what they're looking for in their decision of whether or not to put a procurement out for bid or whether to obtain a few quotes without putting it out for bid. So things that you may want to look for as a small firm, maybe in the startup phases, or you don't have much past performance, and what you can look for things that aren't formally bid. And then we'll talk about top 10 considerations, things you should consider when you are thinking about whether or not you'll submit a response, and review some of the forms that you'll need. There's a standard set of forms, for instance, for bids. Things can look very different, just as on the federal or state side as far for the RFP. So we'll talk a bit about that, give you some tips, and then also go over some resources. Next slide. But before we do any of that, I always like to start with regulations, because regulations are key. Unlike your bidding on something that's with a large corporation, federal and state always have regulations. So with the state, it's the California Code of Regulations. And this subchapter here that I've outlined refers to kind of getting you familiar with what your advantages you have or what rules you have for, per se as a small business with the state of California. So Article 2 is talking about your small business preference as a small business or a disabled veteran business enterprise, what you should be familiar with, certification, and you also should be familiar with the state of California's contracting manual, which talks more specifically about the RFP process, the bid process. So those are just some of the rules and regulations that you should be familiar with. And then I always point out the Prompt Payment Act. So that's one of the great advantages of doing business as a certified firm with the state of California, is that you are privy to the Prompt Payment Act. So next slide, please. Okay, so let's look at what's in determining the procurement method. This is from the contracting officer's perspective. When they have something that they need, what are the things that they consider, and what is it that you should be aware of as far as whether or not you want to bid? So they're going to start with, of course, what type of service is needed and why, and when it's needed. Is it an emergency need? Is it something that we can kind of wait on? So those are some things that go into play. Can the services be provided within the agency? So for example, if they are, say for instance, something that's always a lot of times is purchased or are actually used within the agency, or they don't need to use outside sources, maybe things like technical writing. So for that, they may use, have a department that's dedicated to writing up RFPs or writing up documentation. And the only time they may source that out is if they need additional hands. Not always, but that's just an example of something where the services could be provided by the agency and they may just want to keep that in-house. So other areas that things that they want to consider are interagency agreements. So do they have an agreement, for instance, one agency with another saying, I will purchase all of my janitorial supplies from you? So just if they have an interagency agreement, those are streamlined methods to obtain what they need. So they may want to consider that. So they're kind of going through these steps to make sure there's not an easier, quicker, cheaper way to obtain what it is they need. So if they're looking for an outside contractor, in what way do they want to solicit to that contractor? Will it be something that has to be a non-compete? We're looking for something quickly we need to get, or are there any other exemptions that apply? So we'll talk about exemptions in a future slide. And then what type of contract, of course, is involved? Is it a goods, IT? IT has some special rules that involving around that, or IT goods versus non-IT goods. So what exactly is it that they are trying to procure? So these are some of the initial thoughts that are things that they consider for service items for when determining the procurement method. Next slide, please. So when considering goods, think about this. These are things that they think about. Does the contract have its sole or main purpose of the acquisition as a tangible item? So meaning, is it part of a full service solution? Is there maybe a product that needs to be purchased, but also it needs to be installed? And maybe there's some consulting needed on how it's used. So it's like a full service, a full solution, and so may not be considered an actual good, or is it a full, complete commodity? So it's just a product that they need. So for non-IT goods, for instance, some other things that may consider as far as, is it between $100 and $4,999.99? So if it's within that, in that range, they may accept a phone quote. So that's good for you to know, as far as if you have something that they're buying in that method, and a phone quote is a way that they can buy from you. So as a new vendor, or if you're looking to, be a vendor with the state and you've not gotten the past performance, this may be a way that you can enter depending on what you're selling. And then also, if it's for $4,999.99 through $50,000, it's an informal process. So they may put out a solicitation, but they may not. They're not required to put one out. So also they could also take a phone quote from you as well. So something to consider. But a lot of times what they're looking at there, they are putting out written solicitations. Now, if it's above $50,000, they are required to put out a solicitation, and they're also required to advertise it. So you would see that likely on Cal eProcure. Next slide, Pete. And so here are some exemptions. So we talked about things that they consider and what they have to put out for bid. We were just, speaking of the ranges. However, there are exemptions. There's exemptions to everything. So maybe it's a very small contract. It's under that 5,000 mark. And so that's something they can just exempt from competitive bidding. If it's an emergency contract, which we saw a lot of within this past year with the pandemic, definitely can be excluded from competitive bidding. We talked about interagency agreements, how they can purchase from other agencies, and how that's a streamlined method for them to get what they want or need quickly and not have to go through the full procurement process. So some other things you may not be aware of are contracts for legal defense, expert witnesses. Those are not required to go through the competitive bidding process. So, and then there are some others there. Of course, the small business DVBE option is always something where they can use an exemption, especially if they have the small business first policy, which states that any bid that's between 5,001 and 249,999.99. If they have the small business first policy, it means they should look for 2 small businesses that can meet that requirement or 2 DVBEs that can meet that requirement before putting it out to bid. Next slide, please. And here's kind of an outlay of the different types of contracts, which you probably see a lot if you've looked on Cal Procure It All, or invitation for bids, or primary RFPs. Probably not so many secondary RFPs, but those are one of the different mechanisms they use to contract. So invitation for bids are going to look like, you know, your janitorial services. Some examples that I have here, like pest control, things that really can be pretty much, it's the same type of service or item that's needed so the agency and the scope of work will tell you exactly what they want and exactly how often it should be delivered. For example, like in a janitorial services case, they may say, we need services 3 times per week, and we need it done after hours, and we need these particular things cleaned when the vendor is providing service. So it's very defined. Where a primary RFP is going to, like for instance, for example, professional services, which we know can include so much, but say for instance, in some type of professional service that has consulting, they are going to describe what the complex problem is and what they're looking for in the scope of work, but you will be responsible for responding with how you will solve the problem, how you will provide the solution. So a technical written response on how you will complete the work. Where a secondary RFP, very similar as far as how they would put it out for bid as well. But this is more like even more complex than a primary RFP, in that, you know, maybe they're looking for public relations for the entire state of California. Something that's very complex, maybe a very detailed research project would be classified as a secondary RFP. Next slide, please. So the invitation for bid, I kind of mentioned some of this, but that, you know, you may, it's basically rated on a pass or fail basis, meaning they're going to give you a very defined scope, and they're going to assume that basically you're going to attest that you can do these things, and then you're going to submit your sealed bid with your best pricing, and you'll be rated as a pass or fail. And so this is going to be awarded to the lowest bidder. So it's, again, very defined scope, and the award is made to the lowest responsible bidder. Next slide, please. Whereas a request for proposal, again, complex services like we just discussed, you're going to provide a narrative. You're really going to tell the story of how it is you're going to accomplish the work. And in some cases, there may be other documents that are needed. For example, you may need like an operations plan, or, you know, a full Gantt chart that shows how you're going to get the project up and running. So there's a lot more to a request for proposal, and those are going to vary from, you know, request to request. So this is something that you'll want to review. We'll talk about a few things you want to look for right away to determine if you want to bid. But for each request for proposal, if you're not very familiar with this, you can definitely connect with your counselor if you're already a PTAC client, or become a PTAC client if you're in our service region or within the service region that you're in. And they can help walk you through the requirements for that proposal. But in general, you're going to be providing much more detail as far as what your qualifications are. What have you done as far as, you know, in the range of the scope, the scale of what they're asking? So maybe you've done, you know, this particular consulting services, that you're asking, but sometimes they may say, have you done it for another federal agency or state agency, for example, or have you done it for an agency or even a large company that's of the size and scope of the project that we're asking. So just more detail, more upfront proof, if you will, that you can meet the need. So, and then it's still awarded to the responsible proposer offering the lowest cost for the services, but it's based upon first passing the test of qualifications, capability, experience, and so forth. Next slide, please. So the first step is bid or no bid. So what I always recommend that you do is look at, from starters, 3 different sections. You want to look at the instructions, of course, which will tell you a lot about your due date, your Q&A period, if there's a site visit, for example. But you also want to look at, of course, the scope, look at it in detail to see exactly what they're asking. And finally, the evaluation factors. So this is just for initial quick glance to see, yes, I want to bid, I want to read more, or no, I don't. Not to say that this is your complete evaluation. But by doing that, you're, finding out if you can meet, like, is it due tomorrow? It's not, reasonable to think that I could get this complete. No, I don't want to bid. Or sometimes companies say there's no site visit, so I don't want to bid. I need to see the site to really determine what my pricing will be. So maybe that may be a no-go for you. So just consider, again, reviewing those instructions to see what it is that's required. And then also looking at how that scope relates to what are the final evaluation factors. So if they're going to evaluate you very highly in a particular area where you know that you're just barely meeting, maybe it's not a good use of your time. So those are just some things to consider. Also, does it have a small business or DVBE incentive or preference? How I mentioned that there is a preference, the small business DVBE, well, that was a small business DVBE option, but there's also a preference that can be given. So reviewing the solicitation to see if there's a preference and if that can also benefit you. Next slide, please. So here we're talking about the top 10 considerations of things I think that you should consider before bidding, and it's all written based on from the agency's perspective. What they're going to be looking for, because ultimately they're the ones that are going to be issuing the award. So do you have a good understanding of what the agency's problem is or what are their needs and how you can fit into meeting that? That's hugely important to understanding the first step of whether or not you want to bid. Some other things here, you can read all of this, you'll receive the slides, but does your past performance complement the services being sought? So that's also really key, as I was mentioning on a previous slide about, have you done work in the similar scale, scope of what they're asking for in this solicitation? Should be a really good indicator of whether or not you may or may not want to pursue it. So if you've done things that are really similar, and especially if they're asking for not only for you to state that, yes, I've delivered this type of work, but if they're asking you for, full reference information to reach out to your, the prior companies or agencies that you've contracted with to verify that you've done something similar, think about how that plays into their mind as far as what's really important. So consider these things when you're making a decision of whether or not you're going to bid. And the other thing that's also really important is maybe you're totally qualified. You've done this type of work before, but maybe you just don't have the capacity. You don't have the time to fit this in basically with the other projects that you have. You don't have the fiscal resources to hold this job along with the other jobs you have, personnel resources. So just consider all of these things that go into before making your decision of whether or not you're going to bid. And hopefully you'll develop a process, which I mentioned also in a next slide or upcoming slide, for looking at these opportunities fairly quickly and determining if it's a bid or no bid to move forward. Next slide, please. So these are some common forms for the IFBs, invitation for bid. So if you click on this link here, the orange link, it's going to have a complete sample of the forms. And these are for, again, like I mentioned, the janitorial type services or pest control, those types of things, where they have a very, standard response. So yes, I can provide it. No, I can't, I can't meet it. And here are the forms that attest to what it is that I can do, along with, of course, my cost rate sheet of what I'm going to charge for this service. So they really make it really easy. If you look at this sample, a lot of times this is what you will see for invitation for bid. This is not to say that you don't read it completely, because there may be other requirements that they have added, but it's just something that you can kind of get familiar with as far as the forms that are typically required for an IFB, and also the checklist, so you can make sure that you kind of have everything in order. But just remember that a RFP is going to look totally different. It's going to be a lot more detail and more specific requirements based on what the scope of work is. Next slide, please. So some tips and to-dos. Create a bid or no bid process. I think I kind of beat that one to death. Whether or not you should bid on it or not, based on, like, for instance, the top 10 considerations I think you should think about. Also, just, looking at those 3 sections as far as instructions, as far as scope of work, and as far as the evaluation factors. Looking at where do you come in as far as those areas, how do you fit? And knowing the regulations is always important with anything that's government contracting. Know the regulations and know where to find them. So in the resources slide, that'll be at the end of my presentation, there will be links so you can look at the regulations and just become familiar with what it is that you again, need to be aware of. And if you're not quite ready, which sometimes we're not, it's a good place to start with the state. Not to say that it's, in some places it can be more complicated than federal government as far as, the rules and regulations, depending on what you're bidding on. But for those opportunities that are, small purchases, we just talked about some of the ways that the state purchases for very small purchases, and that's a way to get your foot in the door. There's also where you can apply as a sub seeking a prime. So if you see a great opportunity out there and you are really skilled in that particular work, but you don't feel that you're ready to prime a contract, you don't have, like I mentioned in the previous slide, the resources, the manpower, the past performance to hold this as a prime, perhaps you should consider teaming or subcontracting. So teaming up with another firm to provide that solution, or subcontracting to a firm that may need, one scope, an area that you offer to add into their bid. So there's a link in here as far as what's the process to advertise as a sub seeking a prime. And marketing to the small business advocates and attending events. So events like this one, of course, that we're having today, you're marketing to the advocates when, for instance, if you met with any of the advocates during the one-on-one matchmaking or plan to do that, you're marketing to them. That's another point of contact where you're, talking to an advocate. So attending these virtual events, attending the in-person events when they come back, and of course, reaching out to them by phone and email and letting them know what it is that you provide, and making sure that you are not just approaching them as, how can you help me get a contract, but really understanding what their agency buys. So doing that research, understanding what it is they buy, working with your procurement specialists like Nancy or myself or whatever region you're in to help you identify those opportunities, and looking at the regulations to see what it is you can do. Where can they make those small purchases that you may be able to get in, where you may be able to enter. And then request a debrief. That's if you've bid on something and you did lose. the award, or if you win, actually, request a debrief to see what you did well and what you could do better on. And also just request a copy of winning bids, whether or not, or RFPs, whether or not you bid on it or not. Those that are very similar in scope or nature to what you provide, so you can kind of better be prepared prior to bidding as far as what it is that you, what it is that the agencies that you're buying from, or you're looking at as customers, what it is that they're looking for when they award something. So doing all of that research up front is not, nothing's a guarantee, but helps you be better positioned to be competitive by knowing what is acceptable to the agency, again, from their point of view. Next slide, please. And this final slide is the resource slide I was referring to. There's a lot of good material here, so you'll get this presentation, you'll be able to click on these links, but an invitation for bid model showing you what that model looks like when they put out an IFB, and the same thing for a proposal. So that's very helpful for you if you've not bid before, just kind of understanding what that model is, understanding the regulations, the California Code of Regulations that will apply to you, particularly for small businesses, DVBEs, and understanding what those rules are. And then I've put a couple of other links here. I just talked a lot about the small business DVBE advocates. So this is the link to the directory, and those that are highlighted in yellow will be those that have the small business first policy, meaning if the opportunity is between $5,001 and $249,999.99, then, and there are two qualified small businesses, or two small businesses that offer this, or two DVBEs that offer this, then under that small business first policy adopted by their office, they're required to go out to those two first. So looking for those agencies that have that yellow highlight through their name on this list will show you which agencies have adopted that policy, and then kind of trying to match that up with those agencies that actually buy what you sell. So it's not enough to have one or the other, right? Because they need to actually buy what you sell too. We talked about advertising as a sub seeking a prime. That will be there as well. And then requesting a copy of public records. Again, I think this is something that should be ongoing as part of your process. So as part of your process when you start, requesting a copy of the winning bids that you think are most similar in nature, or maybe your competitors that are already doing this work for the government, or requesting a copy of, a bid after you've lost an award, a specific award that you bid on. So that is kind of completes my overview. And now I will take a few questions if there are any.
Looks like we have one question. By the way, excellent presentation, Christina, as always. Corey is asking if we could point us towards a sample bid for a subcontractor submitting a bid to a prime.
I can't, because that is like a commercial bid. So when you're submitting to a prime, you're actually considered a commercial contractor. So those would be not, the only way we would have access to those is if those were included as part of an award, a submission, and you requested a copy of the winning bid, and that actual subcontractor's presentation was included as part of that. But it's not necessarily public information.
Okay. Nikita's asking, what website do we find the invitation for bid model? Request for debrief?
Right on this page here. If you click on this link, this will take you to the invitation for bid model. To request a debrief, that would be based on, so you submitted a bid and then you were advised by that agency that your bid was not awarded. You were not chosen. So then you request a debrief. So I'd like a review of what I submitted, to sit down with you, either now a virtual meeting, or I would like to, have some feedback provided to me written or by phone call. So they'll tell you what method that they'll provide that information.
Okay, and I'm working on copying that link and putting it in the chat here.
Okay.
There you go. You should have it now. And looks like we have another question. Oh, nope, that was it. Any other questions for Christina before we move on to Nancy's presentation? We get a question from someone saying, if you have a specific question, are we available to contact you via a call? Well, if you apply for Norcal PTAC services, then you can have a one-on-one session with Christina or another one of our procurement specialists. So you can certainly review past webinars if you're outside of our area. But there's PTACs all across the whole country. So if you're in Florida or something like that, first of all, pretty far away from California for contracting, but you are very welcome to apply for a Florida PTAC. But if you're in our service area, by all means, please apply for us. Yes, Christina is more than just a part of Norcal PTAC. She's our senior lead procurement specialist. So we're very happy to have her.
Probably move to the, I'm sorry, I don't want to go into Nancy's time too much.
I think that we're fine right now, right?
Oh, okay, okay.
Well, let's see, what time is it? Oh, yeah, we can switch over now.
Oh, okay.
All right. So the second part of this presentation, as you might have guessed, switches to federal. So as we've just had an overview of state, here Nancy is going to give you the lowdown on federal contracting for those of you who are ready. So as with before, please enter your questions. We have a little disclosure here. So keep those questions coming. And thanks, Nancy, for putting all this together.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. As mentioned, I'm Nancy Pigeon, one of the procurement specialists here at Norcal PTAC. Today, I'm going to present some information and tips on responding to federal government solicitations. And this is a very short presentation. What we could have a workshop on responding to federal solicitations that last, 3 to 5 days. So this is very high level, very basic. If you need extended help with the contract solicitation response or anything else government related contracting, please reach out to your PTAC counselor or join PTAC to receive help for free, as we just mentioned with Christina there. We're more than happy to help you, but I just want you to know that this is, a brief overview and just some tips on how to go through this. So, oh, next slide. Thank you. So today we're going to talk about the types of notices. And sorry, catch up here. We're going to talk about the types of notices, the contract types, how to respond, the brand name, if there's a brand name requirement, what that means. Then we'll go through some work statements, performance work statements or statements of work, how the evaluation will be conducted, and then some do's and don'ts. And then again, I have resources just as Christina had in hers. Next slide. Okay, so there are different types of notices that the government posts that request responses. The first is a request for information, or an RFI. And this type of notice is posted for market research purposes, usually. The government is looking for information about a requirement, and the typical RFI is posted to find small businesses or other socioeconomic sources for a requirement. Or they may post to see if there are any sources that can provide a scarce resource or a service prior to doing a sole source. So if they find there's only one company, instead of going straight to a sole source, they may publish an RFI to find out if anyone else can provide it before they have to do all the documentation to do a sole source. It's really important to answer an RFI if you're a small business, if they're looking to find out how many small businesses can provide a product or a service. If small businesses don't respond, then they'll put it out open, and some large businesses may get that contract when it could have gone to a small business. So, always respond to an RFI if you're a small business and you're interested in the solicitation. The next is a request for quote. It's usually a request for pricing for a supply or service. And it's typically for like commercial off-the-shelf type of supplies. So something easy, you can get easy pricing for it and do an easy quote for it. With no issues. They're usually pretty simple, the requests for quotes. And they can include uncomplicated services, things that don't require, a whole lot of performance work statements or things like that. Now, an invitation for bid is typically used for construction contracts. Usually has a bid sheet of known requirements. The contractor prices out. The bids are all then sent in and opened at a public opening. And the lowest price bid is the apparent winner, but is later verified through, evaluation to make sure that they filled everything out properly and, they have all the requirements. Now, the request for proposal is used for a more complicated type of services or some items or supplies that maybe are not commercial off the shelf. Maybe they need to be manufactured. The proposal request usually contains all the information required for a contractor to put together a response. And then the government will evaluate the response and determine the proposal that best meets the government's needs. So those are the types of notices that you'll usually see out on sam.gov, the RFI, the RFQ, the IFB, and the request for proposal. So just be aware of which type of response or which type of notice that you're replying to, and know that each one of them requires a little bit of a different response. Next slide. Oh, you can skip this slide. I took it out. I guess it didn't take. Okay, now we're going to talk about how to respond. So the most important thing is to read the solicitation document all the way through. I was a contracting officer for many years, and you can tell when a contractor doesn't read the solicitation all the way through. They're missing things or they don't understand the requirement. So the very first thing, the most important thing is to read it all the way through. Next, break the solicitation down into the different parts. If you have like a simplified acquisition, it's going to be streamlined. So you'll break down each section, the front section that tells you, the government agency, or it's usually a standard form 1449, or it could be a combined synopsis solicitation. So just break those parts out. There's the first part that talks about the government and when the offer is due and those types of things. The next section would be the pricing, kind of a Schedule B type of pricing. Then it will come to either like the salient characteristics for a supply, or a PWS, a performance work statement, or a statement of work for a service. And then you'll get into the provisions and clauses. So break all those sections out. And that's if it's streamlined. If it's a more complex requirement, they may be using the uniform contract format where each section is definitely defined. There'll be section A through M, and you can break each of those sections out to review them. And then once you have it broken into individual parts, read through each section and highlight the areas where you have questions and the areas where the government is telling you how to respond to the solicitation. Then you want to send any questions you are unable to resolve to the contracting officer or the point of contact list in the solicitation. Just make sure that the answer isn't right there in the solicitation. Have someone else check it too. It's always good to have two sets of eyes when you're putting these together. And then check the solicitation for the cutoff date for questions, because there's usually a cutoff date that all your questions have to be sent in. The contracting officer will not answer you directly. They usually collect all of the questions. And then at the point of the cutoff, they will answer all the questions and they will post it in an amendment. So make sure if you are you're going to bid on, or not bid, if you're going to submit a response for a solicitation, make sure that you're following that solicitation and sam.gov opportunities, because when the amendment is posted, you'll get a notice that amendment's posted. And usually that is a change to the solicitation or answers to the questions. And then the final part is the solicitation will contain the federal acquisition regulation provisions and clauses. So these are the things that you're going to be bound to. when you sign the contract. Read the provisions and again, highlight the areas that tell you information about how to submit your response or how your response is to be evaluated. And then read the FAR clauses and highlight any of the clauses that require you to fill in a section. And make sure you return the clause with the fill in when you respond. The provisions will not be included in the contract, but the clauses will, sorry. And to save space within the solicitation, provisions and clauses may only be referenced instead of including the full text. Any reference provisions or clauses have the same impact as the full text. And you should look up any provision or clause that is referenced to make sure you understand it. And then over time, as you begin to answer the solicitations and review them, you'll become accustomed to the standard provisions and clauses that are included in solicitations and contracts. You may want to make a cheat sheet. If you're in services, what type of clauses and provisions are usually in the solicitation. Here's a little cheat sheet of what each one of them means. So that's a good tip for having those available to you. And the next slide. And then you want to respond to all elements of the document. If you don't respond to everything that they're asking for, you can be disqualified. They'll just kick your response out at the very beginning and it won't even get evaluated. And make sure you provide all the requested information. And again, you could be disqualified for that. And it's best to have another set of eyes review the response and compare to the solicitation and to ensure all elements and documents are being returned. And of course, I'm talking about someone who's just starting out, maybe looking at solicitations and trying to put something together, try to have a second set of eyes. I know some companies have some larger companies have a full-blown section who do their responses. So, but if you're just starting out, make sure you have someone else to look at it, even if it's your PTAC counselor that you want to have help with. It's always good to have two sets of eyes looking at things because you get tunnel vision and you may forget something. And understand your costs and offer a fair price. Make sure you don't give away your services or products for free just to get a government contract. Always make sure you build in some type of profit that you can live with. And then make sure to include your contract administration information. The government's going to want to know who to contact during the course of the contract. They need to be easily available, but that the contracting officer can reach out to if they have any questions or any issues with the performance of the contract. There's always a section, should be always a section in there for contract administration for you to fill out. And then somewhere in the solicitation is a place for you to sign your offer. This may be on a form such as the SF 1449 if it's a regular solicitation and not a combined synopsis solicitation. For combined synopsis solicitation, the bid or proposal page may have a signature page on it. And just remember, whoever signs the response needs to be the person that is able to bind the company to the contract. So if only the owner can bind the company, then you need to make sure the owner is the signature and not like the sales manager or someone like that, unless they haven't told they can bind the company. And then double check that everything you're returning is in the correct format. The solicitation usually lists how they want things returned. There'll be maybe table of contents, company overview, then your response, and then a separate package for pricing and a separate package for your technical. So just make sure when you're doing that review the first time with the highlighter, make sure you highlight how it says they want things done. They'll usually say in volume 1, I want this, in volume 2, I want this, or tab A, I want this, tab B, I want this. So just make sure that you're following that when you go to turn it in, because if they get a lot of responses and you don't have things turned in properly, they'll just throw you out to begin with because you didn't respond properly. Let's see. Oh, and the last thing there is to make sure you're sending it to the correct location. Most things these days they're accepting by email, except probably invitations for bid. You'll probably have to mail those in or hand carry them if you're in the local area. But most things for supplies and services are usually emailed to either contract specialist or the contracting officer. Just make sure you note that when you're doing your highlighting, who you're going to email it to. If you're mailing it, what's the correct location to send it to? Do you send it regular mail? Do you send it FedEx? Which way are you supposed to return that or turn that in? So just make sure you understand that and get it there before the cutoff. I know some companies work up like right to the last minute to get that in, but you don't want to do that because you never know when a server is going to go down or something goes wrong and your bid doesn't make it. So make sure you're prepared in time to get that in. Next slide. Okay, so those are some of my tips about how to respond. Just the basic tips, and it did assume that you had, some knowledge of government contracting. But I just wanted to give you those tips as myself as being a contracting officer, some of the things that we see coming in. And usually it's that people don't read the solicitation and go through it and make sure that they are turning everything in and complying with all the requirements. So now I thought I would talk a little bit about supply requirements. Sometimes you'll see an RFQ that says brand name only. So for that, that's exactly what it means. They don't want any other product. They only want the brand name. And this is usually because they're already using the brand name and kind of a system. They don't want to bring in another brand or type, which they have to learn that brand or type or have different maintenance on that brand or type. So usually if it's a brand name only, they will have a justification why they're doing that brand name only. And now if it says brand name or equal, that means they're giving you a brand name specification, but they're willing to accept other options. Maybe they don't know what other options are out there. Maybe you have a better option that you want to pitch to them. So if it does say brand name or equal, you can send them an equal, but you'll need to show how your equal compares to the brand name. And you'll also need to include some descriptive literature or performance details, whatever's available to sell that product to them as better than the brand name. So if it's not a brand name requirement or a brand name or equal, usually they're going to have salient characteristics listed there. And the salient characteristics shows everything that is involved in the item that they're looking for. It'll be up to you to either find the best match if you're a manufacturer, if you can build that that item. So maybe it's something to go on another item. I know I had one when I worked for Shasta Dam where we had to have something built to funnel things in. So the salient characteristics had everything that the manufacturer needed to put that proposal together that matched our criteria for that chute that funneled things. So look at the salient characteristics if that's something that you do, and make sure you match up and tell them exactly how you're going to do that, whether through diagrams or engineering drawings, those types of things. And then always include any descriptive literature or specifications with your response, just to show that the government is asking for and you understand the requirement. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so that was supplies. We're talking about how supplies are put out, brand name or equal, or things like that. For services, that's usually going to be either a statement of work or a performance work statement. Mostly these days, it's going to be a performance work statement for services, and typically you'll see a statement of work for construction, but I have seen statements of work for services as well, but they should be moving away from that. The statement of work will tell you exactly how the work is to be accomplished, and those are the specifications the contractor will be judged by. And then the PWS describes what the government wants to accomplish, and the contractor tells the government how they will achieve those objectives. So it's a performance-based contract and not a, I'm going to tell you how to do everything type of contract. Solicitation for service contracts should include a wage determination that specifies a minimum wage that should be paid to the employee on a government contract. And I did put the Department of Labor. The Department of Labor does issue them, but they are now available on sam.gov. If you have to look for a wage determination, they are out there on sam.gov. They did migrate to there. And the government may include the wage determination, or they may reference it. And I've noticed lately that they just reference it. So you have to go find it yourself and look up the rates, you know, for your laborers or any other service component, except for professional services are not included under wage determinations. And then it's up to the contract to ensure their employees are being paid at least the minimum amount listed in the wage determination. It's an hourly rate plus fringe benefits and, you know, health insurance and things like that. So that would be the minimum amount you can pay. From people that I've worked before, that their employees are usually paid more than what is in the wage determination. And then finally, it's a contractor's responsibility to determine the proper amount of employees it needs to perform the work on the contract and the amount they will be paid. So don't ask the government how many people they want on such and such. That's your responsibility, especially in a performance-based contract. Oh, next slide, please. Sorry. I'm moving along here and I forget to ask you. So evaluation, so the government will evaluate your response based on the evaluation criteria they included in the solicitation. Make sure you highlight that when you're reading through the solicitation. The parts that will always be evaluated, the price will always be evaluated. And usually the contracting officer evaluates that because they have to determine that the price is fair and reasonable. So they will take all the prices that they received, compare them to each other, compare them to the government estimate and maybe some commercial type sources to determine that the price is fair and reasonable. If there's a technical component, the government will evaluate how well the technical portion of the response addresses what the government wants accomplished. And usually this is done by the technical people, the people who help put together the performance work statement or the statement of work. They will usually evaluate it because they have the technical expertise and contracting does not. Delivery time is evaluated to make sure the government receives the item by the time they are indicated on the solicitation. Make sure you highlight this during your review. If the government wants something within 30 days and you can't provide it within that time, then you more than likely won't get the contract, you know, unless all the other people who submitted say it's going to be 45 days, then the government would have to, you know, change their point of view of how soon they can get something. For service contract where the management of the contract is a large part of the evaluation, you'll need to make sure you put together a response that includes how the contract will be managed, who will be on the management team, and also include the resumes of the team. And one of the basic evaluation techniques is lowest price technically acceptable. And usually this will be done on supplies or uncomplicated services. So the lowest price, who meets the technical part of the evaluation, you know, will win the contract. Make sure you review the evaluation criteria within the solicitation. Like I said, highlight it as you're going through with that first highlight. And the other categories can be evaluated are past performance or experience on the same and similar contract, and any socioeconomic ownership categories, especially if it was set aside for that, such as woman-owned small business or service disabled veteran-owned. And then here's my little, oh, sorry, next slide. Here's my little list of do's and don'ts. Never submit a response when you know you're going to lose money. I know some people give advice that, you know, just get your foot in the door, but you always want to make some money. So, you know, pare it down as you can, but, you know, don't lose money on the contract. And don't just copy the information from the government solicitation and put it into your response. I mean, especially for the technical part, they want to know how you're going to handle that technical part. So don't just copy it in there and say, yes, we'll do this, or this is how, you know, they don't want that. They want you to tell them how you're going to do it. Don't contact the contracting officer, the program manager during the evaluation. You know, they're very busy trying to do the evaluation, and you're interrupting them won't make it go any faster. So during that period, try not to call. They will let you know as soon as they make a decision and send you that decision. Now, once you turn in your proposal and you don't hear from the contracting officer, then you can definitely follow up and just make sure that they received it. I would do that within the first couple of days of when you turned it in, you know, based on how many they received. They may not have gotten around to notifying everyone, but, you know, just make sure they received it. And then do realize that it takes several tries before you're awarded a contract. Don't get discouraged. Make sure you ask for those debriefings. Like Christina said, it'll give you a world of information about where you stood in the evaluation, what you can do better. You know, always ask those questions. What can I do better for next time? And just learn from each of your tries until you have it narrowed down to the best way for you to respond to solicitations. And I think I have one more slide, my resources slide. Oh, the debriefing for federal contracts, you only have 3 days after they notify you of the award in writing to ask for a debriefing. Okay, next slide.
Sorry, I missed that one, Nancy.
Yeah, it's okay.
That's what you were mentioning earlier.
Yeah, I hate those things. So yeah, just go ahead and put them all out here. Okay. Oh, the last one's not there. I thought I added that. I thought I added that top 10 tips in there. Can you make sure when the slides go out that they're, maybe I forgot you guys did a roll up of the slides. So if you
I'll
could
make a note.
Yeah.
I'll make a note.
Yeah, thank you very much. So these are some of the resources I listed for you. Federal acquisition regulation. That's that's what regulates all federal contracting. So you don't have to know everything about it, but just make sure when you have those provisions and clauses in the solicitation, you want to understand what they say. So look them up. Like I said, make yourself a cheat sheet for each one you do. And that way you don't have to dig back into the regulation each time.
And Nancy, sorry to interrupt. Maybe we can let them peruse these later. We have about 2 or 3 minutes for questions.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
It's all right.
Yeah.
We got started a little bit late, so that one's hardly on you. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I think the first question from Corey is submitting to a prime. I think that was from an earlier, from Christina's presentation. As a sub submitting to a prime, I'm curious if a Google search for a quote template would be okay.
I wouldn't recommend it. I would recommend first seeing what it is you can provide. It's kind of like digging into the next question. So what area can you respond to from the scope of work, and then going to that prime and seeing what they require. I mean, you could just throw something over the fence and find some outline on Google, but it's better to try to build a relationship with the prime and see what they are asking for from you in regards to whether or not you can submit a quote and be included on that solicitation. So go to the prime first.
Okay, good to know. And the second question here from Corey, any recommendations on businesses that do not have any past work yet in regards to scope of work? I know you said that was the previous question touched on it, but.
Yeah. Nancy, you want to, or I don't know.
This was submitted during Nancy's, but either way.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, if you don't have any past performance, if you have past performance working in the commercial environment, I would definitely put that in. It doesn't necessarily have to be government work. It can be anything that you've done in the private industry. If you don't have anything at all, they can when they do the evaluation, they can't rate you negatively on not having past performance. So I think that would be my advice on that is, just to try to, if you have anything private, do that. If not, just do your best to put in the best proposal that you can. Christina, you have anything else?
I just go back to trying to become a contractor, even if it's 1099 contract on something that's being submitted federal or state.
Yeah.
Either way, and try to, so that way you are building some past performance. Even though you're a sub, you're still building past performance with the agency. So that's really trying to build if it's a large enough prime, they have their own events similar to what agencies have. So, try to connect there, of course, with their supplier diversity people as well. But if it's not, just try to reach out to that contractor. Some of them actually advertise, for instance, on, from the federal side on Subnet, they may advertise they're looking for, a large prime is looking for a subcontractor. So there you have a name, a contact name, and an email, and reach out to that person. Make sure you're prepared as far as scope of work, as far as what you can offer to scope of work, and make sure your capability statement is up to date. I know we're out of time, so that's my quick suggestions. I realized I was gone.
Yeah.
No, super, super helpful. And it looks like that's the end of the questions.
Okay.
So pretty good timing, pretty good.
Oh, good. Okay. That's great.
Thanks to both of you for putting this together. This was really great. We're getting lots of love from the audience as well. So, all right. We have one more webinar on the day, and hopefully so far you guys have had some nice meetings out there, the attendees who have joined. But stay tuned, very relevantly, how to follow up with agencies. So if you've had some meetings, what to do next. This is with Thomas Burns, one of our own procurement specialists. So thanks again to Nancy and Christina, and thanks to everyone who's here. We'll start in about 13 minutes with the next one.